Falcha, welcome back. This is video number 2, A New Science of Heaven. Well, I hope your mind is not so blown that you can't follow along here. I was going to talk about my friend's experience with ball lightning. I've never seen ball lightning. But apparently, it's a ball of light, and it looks like a ball of electricity. She was describing it to me, and she said it was in a tree. And it'll do that. It'll just sit in a tree. And one of the things that ball lightning has been observed to do, which has mystified people and scared people for a long time, it wasn't, I think, the 60s before scientists admitted it's real and not mythological. It will sit in a tree, for example, and an airplane will go overhead, and it'll zone in on this airplane and follow the airplane and go into the airplane without losing its shape, roll down the aisle of the airplane and out the other end. Everyone's looking at it. Now, ball lightning can go through you and not hurt you, or it can kill you. They're not entirely certain why that is. I suspect this might tie back to Dolores Cannon's story of what your energy is, what your vibration is. So my neighbor was telling me that when she was a kid, they were sitting in the house one night, and ball lightning came down the chimney, skittered across the floor. She said it was like a little animal. It just and out. It just went through the wall. Okay, that would freak me out, that's for sure. So now, we're on chapter 4 called The 99%. So it's an accepted scientific fact. This is science. Not well known, but accepted mainstream science, that several other forms of matter exist. And beyond solid, liquid, gas, physical matter is very, very rare. Plasma makes up 99% of the universe. Solids, liquids, and gas states are rare, and they keep discovering new kinds of plasma. So we're just beginning to partially understand this. Nearly all the matter in the universe, 99% or more, is plasma, like the sun, the stars, and interstellar space. It's everywhere. It's a non-rigid, electrically conducting medium extending to infinity. The lowest form of plasma form shells around planet atmospheres. So that hasn't been identified. And this book goes on to cite articles and studies and statements of many famous scientists. And I kind of skipped that because you can look that up, and they're basically doing all these different experiments and proving their point, and they're all coming out with the same thing. There's a shell of plasma around the Earth. And in fact, to find a fully intact atom is an abnormality. Very hard to find in the universe. The plasma is rare in terrestrial conditions. So finding plasma compared to the rest of the universe is mathematically, there's less of it. It's all here. It's everywhere. It's inside of us. It's around us. This is fact. This has been shown. But the solid bodies, the ocean, the water, the oxygen, that's what's really rare. Less than 1%. Most matter, almost all matter in the universe, is ionized in a plasma state. So, not in the book. Let's take a little detour. All the stuff that we've been hearing from the metaphysical books we've been doing, they all kind of agree with this. That you're in a body, but there's way more to it. And when you cast off that body, there's this whole entire universe of existence that has to do with vibration and energy. The ancients believed it. Modern metaphysical people believe it. And now physics is proving it. And what I found hard to shift in my understanding is when you think of physics, you're thinking of something without emotion, without thought, without direction, intent. When you think of metaphysics and you think of light beings and spiritual beings, you're thinking of, you can't help it, these benevolent, intentional, morally directed entities. And it would appear from this science that we're talking about the same thing. And we need to expand our understanding of the science of it, but that doesn't negate spiritual aspects. So that's getting those two things together. It's going to take us a while. Nevertheless, science is saying that that's what's happening. Let's see, where are we here? Most matter is ionized in a plasma state. So plasma is electromagnetic, free electrons, a negative charge, and then free protons, a positive charge, and ions, which are positive charge because they're missing electrons. And magnetism, the movement creates magnetism, and that's the fundamental state of matter. And this is the overwhelming consensus of science, mainstream science. It's just not well known. This is like new, 150 years old, in some cases from Aristotle, but it's new. But this has been proven. This is accepted. Plasma is the first state out of which all the others originate. So this is where all this stuff is coming from, is the plasma. Nature began with plasma. Cooling plasma turns into a gas. Cooling gas turns into a liquid, and a cooling liquid turns into a solid. The sun, the stars, and likely giant planets like Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, Neptune were all plasma to begin with. The ionosphere is the sphere of plasma around the Earth, and above it is the magnetosphere, which has huge areas of plasma, which is electromagnetic. Lightning is plasma. If you think of plasma as these moving currents of charged particles, then you can see that lightning is plasma. Fluorescent lights turned on contain plasma. What they're doing is they're running electricity through a gas. Plasma. Flat TVs, plasma TVs, they're probably in your house. Universal laws should not be established on the basis of 1% of the universe. Climate policy should not be based on 1% of the universe. Physics laws should be based on plasma. Right now they're not. And then he says this rearranges science. Physics describes a tiny corner of a much greater truth. It describes everything based on a partial understanding of minority conditions. But we shouldn't be deriving conclusions based on this. Newton. Okay, chapter 5. Great balls of fire. Ball lightning. There's lots of photos of it and film of it, and you can reproduce it in the lab. And there are still scientists who say it doesn't exist. Ball lightning is a plasmoid, a blob of plasma, a ball of fiery light. And it can fly, it can go through solids, it can go down airplane aisles. It used to be called thunderbolts in ancient times. In 1969, the first book was written, scientific book on ball lightning, and it cited 107 cases. In 5.5 years, it talked to over 1,000 people in 16 different countries. Still laughed at. But now we know. That was 1969. Now we know it's real. So within our memory, our living memory, what they ridicule, they now know is fact. And I think it's really important to remember that. Ball lightning is electric. It's got the characteristics of ghosts. It's not affected by the wind. You know, you see Casper flying into the wind and it doesn't affect him. It's not affected by solids. They can pass through solid objects and maintain its shape. It may be associated with intelligent entities through plasma. And sometimes it appears to be under intelligent control, the movement of ball lightning. It seems to inspect people. All these stories, this is why scientists laughed at it. This ball lightning would be moving around, kind of stopping and staring at people. And it will pursue and enter airplanes. And he posits this question, which I love this. So are these like little drones? Are ball lightnings really plasma reconnaissance from the K clouds? He suggests that ball lightning, similar to certain phenomena like some UFOs, might be scouts, might be surveillance drones from the clouds. Now we're using terminology that's like, oh, come on. But it's the best we can do. It would explain the movement of UFOs. We're seeing, they're manifesting as that to us. And we know that the narrative is, the accepted story is, that these contain high vibrating energy beings. That's what we're talking about when we talk about plasma clouds. So he suggests the ball lightning, I read that. Okay, storage capacity of these K clouds is 9 times the size of the Earth. And it means the entire human history could be stored by them in these double helixes that they have, which is far greater ability for knowledge than any supercomputer ever invented. Then he talks about 3 different books by 3 different authors who helped each other. They shared each other's bibliographies and helped each other with their point of view, their research. They shared the same basic bibliography. So we've got Stanley Singer in 1971 wrote The Nature of Ball Lightning. James Barry in 1980 wrote Ball Lightning and Bead Lightning, Extreme Forms of Atmospheric Electricity. And in 1999, Mark Stenhoff wrote Ball Lightning, an Unsolved Problem in Atmospheric Physics. So they shared this bibliography. They helped each other. And now this is where things get conspiratorial and weird. They were helped by the Office of Naval Research, NASA, and the U.S. Air Force. And they include, this bibliography includes the translations of many foreign sources. And the example they give is Raytheon, which Raytheon built a flying disc in 1960 for the Air Force to study plasma. So now we have this official scientific research, government, military funded, building disc flying saucers to study plasma. They're connecting plasma physics, UFOs, the military, and the government. Okay. So the money went to defense research because they hoped that they would be able to weaponize ball lightning, because of course they did. There's been a lot of research by the US and Soviet governments on ball lightning, and it's still top secret. We're not allowed to know. So then he cites a 1988 symposium in Tokyo. It was the very first symposium on ball lightning. Imagine going to that. Can you imagine the dinner table conversations? This is the first time, though, that people got together that weren't government. These were 54 scientists from 8 countries. And it was funded, very interestingly, by 19 major Japanese corporations. there's something going on here. There's a profit to be made. Ball lightning can enter closed rooms. It had appeared in submarines in World War II. It appeared in airborne planes. It goes up and down chimneys. It inspects things inside the house when it comes in, like it will inspect the pattern on carpeting. Like if you've got a Persian carpet. They can be deadly. They can kill you, but they're usually harmless. And they're often described as fireballs. And here's a quote. I think I'm going to read it. I'm not sure yet. Okay, yeah, I'm going to read this. It's kind of interesting. Fireballs possess sensory, energy generation, navigation, and propulsion systems. This is ball lightning we're talking about. Since ball lightning is buoyant, how come some fall rapidly from the clouds, like falling cannonballs, rebound before hitting the ground, and float lazily against the wind, or rapidly shoot back up to the clouds? How does a ball know where an aircraft is, follow it closely, and not be affected by 500-mile-an-hour airflow and turbulence, and not just tumble or be swept away in the wind and turbulence? What possible detection, sensory, energy generation, navigation, and propulsion system do fireballs possess? No other natural or man-made control feedback system matches their incredible behavior. A microprocessor-based system or fireball with sensors that can materialize and fly, then detect electromagnetic, electrostatic, metal, solid objects, chimneys from a distance, distinguish a standing person from a post, and so on, would be an amazing feat of technology. But for a supposedly hot ball of gas, it's not made of semiconductors and wires. To do these tasks of sensing, control, and navigation is not a question for technology, but a mystery of physics. And I would add two kind of interesting facts. Another, something similar to ball lightning, orbs. Orbs have been identified very, very frequently in the sightings of UFOs, in the sightings of Sasquatch, and just in general around psychic stuff. So the author edits this whole thing. He says wires and semiconductors are not necessary to carry current, as recent plasma studies have now shown us. So he talks about equivalence, equal charges. Complex plasmas can become crystals, and because of the equivalence, so this is getting into the weeds, but the complex plasmas become crystals, and they are self-organizing. So what this book does is discuss ongoing linear discoveries and repeated experiments that prove a point that was debated after the first time it was posited. So it does sometimes repeat itself, but it gets more in depth every time. So ball lightning is associated with poltergeist activity. It's associated with spontaneous combustion. And interestingly, I guess, I don't know what I think about spontaneous combustion. I should really look into it. But there are cases that they say have been documented where a person will burn up, and sometimes their clothes and their skin is not burned, just internally. Ugh. Ball lightning is associated with cases of entire rooms being destroyed as if by an angry ghost. Not on fire, but like wrecked. Psychical researchers often are called to investigate cases of paranormal phenomena that are associated with ball lightning. And as I said earlier, anticipating, because I read the book, UFOs and ball lightning are often associated. In 2002, the Royal Society of London did a volume on ball lighting at their philosophical transactions thing. And ball lightning research has started to come out of the top secret closet, they said, including input from the U.S. and Soviet researchers who worked with the military and the government in ball lightning. They're starting to share some of this with scientists. So then we have 1943. This is another part of the research. 1943, a Mexican scientist suggested that ball lightning might be what's called a standing wave. Ball lightning moves through space. It moves through denser objects, but it keeps its shape and it keeps its internal structure. But it can sometimes shatter after it hits a solid. It could electrocute you or it could be harmless. And the author says he saw ball lightning once in a tree while he was driving, and it was 4 feet across, and he felt like it was watching him. Ugh. Another time, when he was asleep, he felt somebody, and this is a scientist, when he was asleep, he felt that somebody was in the room with him. And he woke up, and his plasma TV had turned itself on, but it wasn't an ordinary channel. It was just a gray screen. There was no static. He said it felt like the TV noticed that he was awake and it quickly turned itself off. One night, alone in his office, his printer turned itself on and it spewed out a photo of a recently dead friend. And he said, you know, the picture of the friend was in a file, electronic file, and it was one of thousands of pictures, but that was the one that spontaneously came out of the printer. He said he was a very close friend, and it was exactly the kind of thing his friend would do just to torture him. So his theory is ball lightning is charged plasma crystals with massive amounts of dust particles that make them visible. It has to be a lot for them to be visible. In 1955, the Russians theorized that the electric field that supplies energy for ball lightning has geometry. That's huge. So we now know that there's a crystalline structure. So the Russians were already talking about this in the 50s. It's an energy field. And this structure is a rigidly fixed pattern. It's a higher order of structure, this crystalline structure. This was a new concept. Crystalline here means a regular inner structure of atoms arranged in regular lattice connections, which makes up the majority of solids. Rocks, ice, metals, sand, loam, there are very few non-crystalline substances. Lattices are connected, charged particles, and each one is very different. The electric force between ions is so strong because the positive is surrounded by the negative is surrounded by the positive, and as we know from the laws of nature, opposites attract. So this inner structure of plasma facilitates computation, it facilitates memory, it facilitates intelligence. Plasma clouds are polycrystalline. They're submicroscopic. We can't see them. That's because, remember I said they extend for gigantic distances. But he says, think about an iceberg. An iceberg, you only see a little bit of it. The rest of it is underwater. That whole thing can be one single crystal in structure. So plasma can be the size of a whole galaxy. And so going back to the K clouds, plasma can store information. They could store information. It can communicate. We know it can store and communicate because they use it in computers. It can store information, it can communicate, it is self-organizing and self-replicating. He says, hello, there is intelligent life out there, and we may be looking at it all the time. All the stars, the sun, everything we see out there, that may be the intelligent life. Free energy as electrons in a crystal will form a complete sphere, and is that what ball lightning is? They're not sure yet. The book shows a photo of ball lightning behaving in 3 dimensions as electrons bouncing around crystal lattices do. And they show this picture. I won't even show it to you because it took me forever to figure out what they were talking about. But essentially what they were able to see was that there's some sort of structure in a crystal that ball lightning is moving around inside of. And because 2 different electrons are bouncing in the same directions and in the same pattern, they're in the same structure, basically. So you may be able to use geometry of the path of what they see to describe the structure they're inside of. So it's describing organ systems by describing the void. Plasma crystals are very common. Solid crystals like this are extremely rare. Not because they're really valuable, it's probably worth $5, but because they don't happen in the larger relative universe. They don't happen very much. So trying to understand the universe by only studying 1% of it gives a very distorted picture and not a real understanding. We have to pull ourselves out of the Earth-centric view. Then he talks about a soliton. Remember I said the Mexican scientist who thought that plasma might be like a standing wave? Okay, so soliton. I had to look this up. A soliton is a solitary wave that maintains its speed and maintains its shape with a constant velocity, and they are ubiquitous in nature. And the one that immediately comes to mind is a tsunami. It's a giant soliton. But another soliton is a photon. And solitons are used in fiber optics because they can travel great distances and not be distorted, and that helps communication. Well, ball lightning acts just like a soliton. So store all this away in your crystalline structures up there, because now we're going to move to chapter 6, When Heaven Was Young. So there are many ancient accounts of people in meditation who encounter glowing balls of fire of a divine nature. Gnosticism from the Middle East 2,000 years ago was a light theology. So we're talking beings of light, increasing your vibration, leaving behind the physical world and moving on to a higher frequency, greater awareness, more universal connection. Many groups, many schools, the Essenes, for example. The belief was that elite people of higher spirituality would survive a corrupt physical world, and after physical death, they would enter a kingdom of light inhabited by a variety of plasmic deities called the Father. Jesus spoke of the kingdom of the Father because he spoke in metaphors. The light of the Father was brighter than 10,000 times 10,000 suns. Without a physical body, the Father was a ball of light. Elite people would become light balls and live forever in plasma heaven. This is the foundation of a lot of Gnostic thought. Gnosticism came much earlier than Christianity, and it was existing in early Judaism. Remember, Jesus was a Jew and not a Christian. He didn't say, I think I'm going to follow the teachings of that guy Christ. Christos actually comes from the Greek word for holy oil. It means anointed. And the Messiah is another word that means the anointed. Doesn't mean the Savior. So Jewish Gnostics believed that the book of Genesis was an allegory. They did not take it literally. They didn't believe that there was an ark. They believed, this is interesting, early Jewish Gnosticism believed that Noah escaped the cataclysm by hiding in a plasmoid light cloud. Their texts are full of descriptions of plasma. They describe a plasma universe. They saw what only now our science is acknowledging. Then there's this thing called I had to write it phonetically because I never pronounce it right. Manichaeism. And this was a religion of light. So Gnosticism lasted until the extermination of the Cathars in southern France in the Middle Ages. Big power struggles, what that was all about. And in the 16th century, there was the fading away of the Bogomils in Bulgaria and the fading away of the Massalians, who were a Slavic form of Gnostics. But the most famous plasma that we know about was Moses and the burning bush. He says, think about it a second. The bush was burning, but it never burnt itself up. It just sat there burning. What was that all about? It was a plasma. And he says, just FYI, it wasn't on Mount Sinai. It was on Mount Horeb. And at the top of Mount Horeb, he went there, the author. He says there's still a temple of Hathor. And the Hathor had a cult image, which was a golden calf. Many of historical stories of encounters with spiritual plasma beings exist. Higher entities, deceased people, gods, and what they describe very much as an encounter with a being of plasma. Moses was credited for making Jews monotheistic, but Gnostic Judaism persisted for centuries and kind of morphed into Gnostic Christianity. And then it was ferociously persecuted by the early Roman Catholic Church, because that was what they did. For example, in the book of Enoch, the Gnostic Gospels, the Dead Sea Scrolls, all the writing that was found hidden away in clay jars in Qumran, in the hills over what was the Essenes community, included writings that had pretty much been eliminated by the status quo dominant group of early Christians and, Catholic Church. The earliest Christians had written the book of Enoch, and he encounters what he calls the divine radiance, the great glory, a wall of crystal surrounded by flame. This is in the story. He describes flames, sun, fire around the great glory. He's taken to a place of plasma light beings who could take on human form. The book of Enoch was the canon, the basic religious text for Ethiopian Christian church. And if you remember, we did the sign and the seal with Graham Hancock about the Ark of the Covenant. We might need to revisit that in light of, pardon the pun, light of plasma physics. Around 500 AD, the Platonic philosopher Damascus believed that the human spirit was a radiant body that in lower states of energy gets darker and becomes material. In 550 AD, Philoponus of Alexandria said this spirit was actually a higher soul that was attached to a basic soul, and that the higher soul was star-like, higher energy, more light, more energy. The Egyptians believed something like this, that the soul had more than one level. You kind of think about the earth being solid, and then there's the atmosphere that's gaseous, and it's got different layers, and then there's plasma, and that's kind of how they thought of the human soul, that it was as you got to its basic part, it was the lowest energy, and then it elevated, it got faster. And the Egyptians believed it forever keeps its radiant body of an everlasting nature. In 1945, when the shepherd boy stumbled on the Gnostic Gospels, one of them was the Apocalypse of Adam. Adam tells Seth before the fall, who's Seth? No. I thought it was Adam and Eve. Tells Seth before the fall that he and Eve before the fall, he doesn't tell him before the fall, he tells him about the time before the fall when he and Eve were radiant and glowing. But eventually they will return to the divine region and will become clouds of great light. Also in 1945, a guy called Marsanus postulated that the third shape of the soul is spherical. Many ancient texts talked about men and higher entities that have souls of radiant glowing spheres. Now, mind you, we're still on this science book. Are we too attached to this physical earth in our thought processes? We get karmically attached and we become darker. We stop radiating light. He said, is this what we're talking about? Fallen angels and the demons of darkness. We're just talking about light energy that has been slowed down. In 1945, they found the paraphrase of Shem. There were heavenly clouds of fire described, garments of light described, the light of the Spirit, and thought that comes forth from the light. The righteous spark is the cloud of light that has shone in your midst, is a quote. In 1945, they found the Apocryphon of John from the early 3rd century A.D. that talks about luminous clouds, that Moses' story was wrong. There was no ark. The Moses story about Noah, that Noah and the other men hid in a luminous cloud. This is the stuff that was attempted to be completely destroyed by the early Christian church, by the way. And devils were also in luminous clouds that they created for themselves. And what he's saying is that this implies the devil lives in fiery plasma clouds. There was a war in heaven, a battle between good and bad plasma. And in the end, the elect who have remained good, despite the temptations of the lower earth, will rise to the light and the power of darkness will be annihilated. These stories persist and are dismissed, but science is now able to reshape divine plasma entities, and science now confirms they not only exist, but they probably have a form of intelligence. The helpful ones are radiant with light. The harmful ones are dark and perverse. And he postulates that we're talking about plasma light that's contaminated with dirt. There are other examples. For example, Aristotle's pneuma. In the 4th century BC, Aristotle's anticipation of plasma physics and bioplasma. He wrote 2 books of poems. He freed his slaves, and he had to flee Athens in part because of a poem that he wrote, an ode to his deceased wife, that was too high a view of women for the male chauvinists running things in ancient Athens. Also, he wasn't from Athens. He was from the north, so he was suspect because he was an alien. He was the first Western thinker to postulate a form of matter that wasn't physical, and he called it the ether. And I remember so clearly the nuns, we'd read, I guess maybe we were reading Aristotle, and she, said, something to the effect of it was so quaint that they thought there was this invisible energy that connected everybody, and we communicated through it, except they were right. Aristotle was right. So he called it the 5th form of matter: earth, air, fire, water, and ether. So that was the 5th element, or the quinta essentia in Latin, the quintessence. He said it was in the region above the moon in outer space, and that's where the plasma clouds are. He was right. He suggested that we each had an etheric body, a bioplasmic body, and guess what they think they've discovered? So he wrote a lot of this in his dialogues, and there are only fragments of it left. In 1989, a guy called A.P. Boss wrote Cosmic and Metacosmic Theology in Aristotle's Lost Dialogues, which pieces a lot of this stuff together. Aristotle believed that we and divine beings had the spirits of the fifth element, and at our death we returned to the world of the fifth element above the atmosphere. That part of the fifth element that animates us in the physical world is the pneuma. Aristotle predicted the theories of Crookes' fourth state of matter 2,200 years earlier than Crook. He was the guy whose theory of this fourth state of matter eventually was known as plasma. The Chinese didn't have a dichotomy of spirit and body. The Taoists believed that the spirit was special matter, just like a mist and part of the rest of you. A belief in ghosts is a strong part of Chinese culture even today. They believe that departed wise people, the Shen, flew in clouds and thought big thoughts. That ordinary people were ghosts and lower than the Shen and more problematic. And then there were fox fairies, which were dangerous, of course, female ghosts. Much Chinese fiction and mythology is about plasma beings. Huge chasms in history and cultural thinking on all of this exist, but the whole concept of plasma is not a big surprise in Chinese culture at all. They have no problem understanding it and accepting it. They knew that it existed. They knew it eluded our sight and our other senses. Lao Tzu, the founder of Taoism, this is a quote, "The form of that which is without the body." And he knew that it was structured, and he was talking about plasma. Many ancient texts talk about the creation of matter from speech. This is an important idea he's putting out here. In the beginning was the Word. Brahma created the universe by opening his mouth, and out came the Vedas, the sacred texts. In Egypt, Ptah, P-T-A-H, Ptah, created a world with speech. Quote, "His speech is light." Ra, the sun god, speaks with light. Early Christians believed the word of God was light. You extrapolate that the 1% is the creation of the 99%. Material universe comes from the universal plasma. The ancients said that chaos and ocean and sea and waters existed in the beginning. And that is exactly what existed in the beginning, a vast universal ocean of plasma. This gives me chills. This is fascinating. It's the first time I've enjoyed physics, I have to tell you. Chapter 7. Kristen Birkeland's miraculous discovery. So now we're going back to Norway. He was born in 1867, died in 1917. And he was on Norwegian currency until 2018. He studied the aurora borealis. And the aurora borealis, he predicted, was a stream of charged particles from the sun, from the poles of the sun, and the particles glowed. He was called a madman because, of course, space was a vacuum. It was empty, right? Well, they proved that he was absolutely right. In the 1960s, they proved his theories true. The Northern Lights were well known to the indigenous people of the North. In 1220 AD, there's a saga from Norway called The King's Mirror, and it talks about the Northern Lights. Aristotle mentions them. This is the earliest surviving text that actually mentions the Northern Lights. He speculated that earth vapor met sun's fire. He said it was a layer of fire encircling the earth. Well, guess what? We have the ionosphere. Homer in the Iliad talked about Zeus living in the ether. Zeus comes from the word zessen, which means boiling. They were seen in Greece at one point. Plutarch in the 4th century after Aristotle talked about them in the life of Lysander. Lysander. They were mentioned by Seneca in 65 AD, by Pliny in Natural History in the 1st century AD, Kepler and Galileo. Galileo saw them when he was in Venice, and he named them in 1621. Or they were named by a guy called Gassendi, but they were named in honor of the goddess of the dawn, Aurora, or Eos. In 1640, the Spanish saw them in Chile, the Southern Lights, and they were first written about by a Jesuit priest, modern, Western, 1782. In 1716, they were drawn in a pamphlet. It was very bizarre. The writing suggests that the aurora is spiritual entity. Here we go again. And it refers to much writing about the aurora previously that, we don't have. In 1735, a French scientist named Jean-Jacques de Morin said perhaps it's material from the sun being deposited within the Earth atmosphere that caused the aurora. He said the atmosphere of the sun is a light and tenuous fluid that reached as far as the Earth. Pretty true. And this anticipated the theories of Birkeland by 169 years. So there's descriptions from Laplanders hunting by the light of the aurora. In 1770, Captain Cook's log talked about the southern lights, the aurora australis. In 1878, Lemstrom reported the aurora varied with the sunspot cycle of 11 years. It's a current of charged particles, but electricity wasn't known yet when he posited this. In 1882, the ionosphere was described by a guy called Stewart. And then we come to 1896, back to Birkeland, the beginning of our chapter. He said the sun emits rays of electricity that come into the atmosphere, are drawn to our poles, and electricity can't cross empty space. So how does that happen? And he may have been the first to predict that plasma is ubiquitous in space, because his theory necessitated the understanding that there was something in space. It wasn't a vacuum. And he was also the first to predict the behavior of the solar winds. But everyone paid attention to Newton, which led to material mechanical views of the universe, solid objects in dead space, in a vacuum. I think we have time to do one more chapter. Yeah. Chapter 8, The Cosmic Web. In 1933, a guy called Zwicky wrote Dark Matter. And it was unseen. He observed, looking into space, he saw this place where something was interfering with gravitational forces. There was an area, it was measuring gravitational forces, and there was just this area where you could describe the shape of it because of the lack of gravitational forces, like something invisible was blocking the forces, and that's why it's called dark matter. It's not something you can see, but it created a darkness in the receiving of gravitational forces. But he was ignored and his research was blocked, which is interesting. 1936, a guy called de Zambuja, who was French, said that the sun spewed out material, solar wind. He was ignored. Zwicky was ignored and blocked. They wouldn't publish him. This is in the 30s. The establishment just refused to believe. The status quo of ignorance is what the author calls it. Zwicky finally was published in a biology journal, because they would publish him when physics journals wouldn't. And when he published in this biology journal, other scientists took notice and said, well, wait, why did he have to publish that in a biology journal? And the whole story of the scandal came out about him being blocked and not being allowed to publish. That's illegal. So military, security, and corporate entities block scientists all the time today. They force astrophysicists to sign non-disclosure agreements. They threaten them with jail, and then they make everything that they do top secret. And we're going to get even more into this. So if and when they do release stuff, they are heavily redacted. So the author wanted to see this particular report, and he had to travel himself, fly to the CIA in Maryland, and he wasn't able to copy it. He wasn't able to take notes. He could just look at it. He found earlier works of Fred Hoyle. Remember, we mentioned him before. Hoyle and Littleton in 1940 knew that space was not empty but full of ionized gas, plasma. But he was unable to publish because of this strict censorship. So why are they keeping this secret? In 1967, Hannes Alfvén named these Birkeland currents, these currents, he named them Birkeland currents for Birkeland, who discovered them, because he predicted the solar winds. And he discussed a plasma medium and therefore electric currents between the sun and the earth. It makes sense. Plasma is a network of filaments that's carrying these currents, and the universe is full of electromagnetic fields. They charge particles which modify the fields. Outer space is a jungle of plasma, a charged ecosystem that creates matter. And has filaments of magnetic areas that are fields like ropes. And they carry positive and negative currents of particles immense distances throughout space. And these can form bundles of filaments, and they often form into double helixes. So here we go with confirmation of this theory. In 1911 came the idea of superconductivity. A current can pass through certain materials with zero resistance, and there was no complete explanation for this. Now, a Birkeland current is composed of layers of supervortices. Remember the spinning of the sun? Well, these currents from the sun are spinning, and when they spin, they form helixes. It's very efficient for conducting current, and it can link galaxies. Photos from the International Space Station show glowing traces of charged current, and astrophysicists call them field lines, but they're not magnetic. They look like eerie, glowing green rivers. And these are pictures that the International Space Station took. These space rivers are made out of flowing subatomic particles that are full of information. So our planet, through plasma coming from the sun, connects with the sun by these threads, these filaments, electrical currents, as do all the planets. It's all connected. As above, so below. We're all connected. It's a cosmic web, is what he's calling it. One person called it the Sloan Great Wall. It is 1.37 billion light years long, one of these filaments. 1.37 billion light years long, coming from the sun and going someplace into the universe. But they can also be microscopic. Our bodies are full of these currents. The Birkeland currents are structured like DNA. Scientists say that charged currents flow along DNA molecules and inside us, and that they're superconducting. They carry currents. They transmit information. And magnetic field lines are fictitious pictorial representatives of a field. They don't really exist. If you go to a physiology book, it'll show you that. But these don't really exist as magnetic fields. These are electrocurrents. And he says what they really look like is contour lines on a map. And when you look at pictures of them in physiology books, he says to remember that they're not real. They exist, but you can't see them. So they're visual aids. They're not really little lines inside your body. So we don't know really what an electric field is. We know it's there, but we don't really know what it is. We explain how the Birkeland current is formed by electric fields, but we're explaining without full knowledge. It begins with charged particles spiraling along and pushed by an electric field. The electric field, now here's where I was like, okay, this is getting too much like regular physics. The electric field is always perpendicular to the magnetic field, and this pushes things along. Article of faith. So the current flows in a direction determined by the magnetic field, because it's always perpendicular. And as the current moves, each creates its own, what's called an azimuth. It's a magnetic field around itself at right angles, and it causes it to deviate its course. This is called the Hall effect. And in big capital letters with 6 million question marks, I wrote WTF because I did not understand this. I tried so hard to understand this. I think, in essence, we're talking about an explanation for how these things actually move. It's the functional explanation of what's going on. And it's the relationship between electricity and magnetism. And that is what makes it move. And that's the Hall effect. But, oh God, I'm getting a headache now. And this causes the formation of the double helix. It gets closer and tighter, and it pinches into place. And when it pinches into place, it forms what's called Z pinches. They're little nodes. And where these pinches occur and the nodes are, plasmoids form. And they spin, and they attract particles, and they form blobs and become whirlpools. And they can create stars, atomic matter, X-rays, neutrons. And this has led to a theory of the electrical universe, that the universe is a cosmic web. So I hope by that explanation helped. It's a little heavy. But, so there's this cosmic web, these flows of plasma come from the sun, they're turning and spinning, creating electromagnetic movement. These things spin and form double helixes, charges in a helix. They finally pinch, and where they pinch, they form blobs, and they create stuff. We have a similar situation going on inside our body as goes on in interstellar space. So these nodes become stars, and in intergalactic space, they become galaxies. And we're all part of this universal process. And I have a photo. Oh, it's my favorite picture in the whole book. Now, I'm going to hold it up close so you can see. Imagine that this rectangle is divided horizontally exactly in half. And if you can see this line right here. Okay, look at the top. And now look at the bottom. Very similar. This seems a little more dense. This seems a little brighter. So what you're looking at the top, okay, this says filaments are fundamental to the universe and to all entities. They carry current, and they carry information in the form of signals. They can transport energy and so forth. In the universe as a whole, they are everywhere. Here we see two similar adjoining images. The top one shows the cosmic web of the universe. So this is all the plasma connecting the stars and the planets. It's a little picture of it. And the line between the two things is the horizontal line here. So at the top, that's the cosmic web. And below that, I'm so excited to say this because it blew my mind. Below that, they show the neural network of the human brain. Both are constituted of masses of filaments separated by voids and joined at intersection points called nodes. The cosmic web is called that because of the web-like nature of the filaments. And then it goes on to talk about the scientists who did it. But the top, the universe, the bottom, your brain. Mind-blowing, right? Okay. I'm going to stop here. This is starting a new chapter. It's a good place to stop. I don't think I'm going to do a third video this week because this is a lot and it requires real digestion to process all this information. I would suggest think about this in the context of these other books that we've been doing about near-death experiences, out-of-body experiences, poltergeist activity, UFOs, and all the works of Dolores Cannon. Think about this physics, and I will reiterate, true, fact, accepted, mainstream physics that nobody knows about. So thank you very much for watching. Please give me questions for the cards, which I will do tomorrow. And in the meantime, slanga foil and slancha.